The silence that had fallen over the town was unnatural in its depth, a void so complete it pressed on Tom's chest like a physical weight. The radios, once alive with static and spectral voices, now sat mute, their dials frozen in stillness. Yet, beneath this quiet, Tom felt a trembling unease, a subtle pulse that suggested the battle was far from over. He found himself standing before the familiar door of the town's library, its wooden frame weathered but sturdy, a beacon of knowledge and refuge. Margaret Lane greeted him with a nod, her sharp eyes reflecting the same cautious hope that Tom carried. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged paper and dust, the quiet only broken by the steady ticking of an old clock mounted on the far wall. "It's too quiet," Tom whispered, his voice barely more than a breath, almost like the calm before a storm. Margaret nodded slowly, pulling a worn volume from the shelf. "The silence isn't peace. It's waiting. The entity, whatever it truly is, has withdrawn, but its shadow lingers." They pored over the town's archives, seeking patterns and clues that might explain the hollow presence's sudden retreat and its persistent influence. Each record revealed stories of grief, loss, and strange disturbances echoing through the decade stories that now felt eerily connected to the recent events. Later, Tom visited Eli Jacobs in his cluttered radio studio. A faint, almost imperceptible crackle of static filled the room despite the radio's official silence. Eli's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the dials, eyes scanning the screens for any sign of the entity's return. "I thought it was over," Eli murmured, voice tense. "But this feels like a warning." Tom stood silently beside him, listening. The static was faint but persistent, like a whisper just beyond hearing. Days passed, and Tom found himself wandering the town's empty streets at dusk, the fading light casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and shift with a life of their own. The cold wind carried faint echo-soft murmurs tangled with the rustling of dead leaves. He paused beneath a weathered sign, its creak slicing through the oppressive quiet, a reminder that the town was still alive, still vulnerable. In the small cafe where they had first shared coffee in the early days of his investigation, Tom, Margaret, and Eli met again. Voices were low, laden with the weight of what they knew and feared. "We need to be ready," Margaret said firmly. "The hollow presence feeds on grief and fear. If we can break that cycle, maybe we can weaken it." Tom nodded, the sorrow in his eyes tempered by a flicker of resolve. "I don't want to lose anyone else. Not to this, whatever it is." Eli added, "The radios might be quiet now, but the airwaves never truly sleep. We'll listen, always." As they spoke, the comforting aroma of coffee filled the room, a small but precious anchor to normalcy amid the lingering dread. Outside, the town began its slow, fragile recovery, but Tom knew the echoes of the hollow presence would haunt them for a long time to come. The silence was not the end, it was a pause, and in that pause, the shadows waited. The room was heavy with silence, the kind that presses down on the chest, making each breath feel like a labor. Tom sat alone, slumped in his worn armchair, the dim light of a single lamp casting trembling shadows across the walls. Before him, on the cracked wooden table, lay scattered photographs, snapshots of a life that once was, Claire's bright smile frozen in time, her eyes capturing a warmth that now seemed painfully distant. He reached out, fingers trembling, to touch one of the photos. It was an image taken on a summer's day, Claire laughing as sunlight dappled through the trees, her hair catching the breeze. Tom's throat tightened, a familiar ache blossoming in his chest. The radios were silent now. The voices that had once seeped through the static, the fractured warnings the familiar tones, had all but vanished. Yet the silence was not peace. It was a void filled with restless memories and unspoken fears. Closing his eyes, Tom let the memories wash over him. He saw Claire's gentle smile, heard the soft cadence of her voice as she read to him during long nights when illness had claimed her strength. He remembered the way she would reach for his hand, offering comfort even when her own spirit faltered. The guilt gnawed at him, the helplessness of those final days, the whispered prayers unanswered. A sudden creak from the house stirred him. The wind rattled the window pane, carrying with it a chill that seeped under the door. He shivered, not from the cold, but from the weight of absence. He opened his eyes and looked around the room, empty, save for the relics of a past life. The silence seemed to pulse, a living thing holding its breath, waiting. The following afternoon, a soft knock at the door pulled Tom from his reverie. Margaret Lane stood there, holding a bundle of aged papers tied with a faded ribbon. Her sharp eyes softened as she stepped inside, setting the documents carefully on the kitchen table. "I found these in the archives," she said quietly. "Letters, diaries, pieces of the town's past. There's more to this story, Tom, more than just the voices on the radio." Tom nodded, grateful for the company, for the distraction. Together, they spread the papers out, the afternoon sun filtering through the curtains, casting a warm glow over their shared endeavor. As they sifted through faded ink and fragile pages, fragments of history came alive. Stories of loss, of inexplicable disappearances, of grief that clung to the very air of the town. "It's a cycle," Margaret murmured. "Grief feeding grief, the hollow presence. It's been here longer than we imagined." Tom swallowed hard, the weight of the revelation settling over him. His personal sorrow was but a thread in a tapestry of collective despair. Later that evening, Eli Jacobs stopped by. His usual casual demeanor was tempered by a newfound seriousness. He brought with him technical equipment and a quiet determination, a stark contrast to the skeptical radio host Tom had first met. "The static's gone," Eli said, setting down a small receiver, "but that doesn't mean it's over. Sometimes silence speaks the loudest." Tom glanced toward the silent radio sitting on the shelf. He hesitated, then reached out, fingers trembling as he switched it on. The dial clicked, but no crackle of static greeted him, only profound, enveloping quiet. He sat back, heart pounding. The absence of sound was haunting in itself. Yet beneath that silence, he sensed a faint, almost imperceptible pulse, a whisper of Claire's distant echo, a fragile thread linking him to a past still unresolved. For hours Tom wrestled with his emotions, grief, hope, dread, tangled together like the static on the radios that once filled his nights. The journey toward healing felt tentative, like stepping onto thin ice, unsure if it would hold. As dawn crept through the blinds, Tom realized that while the voices had ceased, the presence lingered. The boundary between past and present, life and death, was fragile but enduring. He would carry the weight of loss with him, but perhaps now, for the first time in a long while, there was space to breathe, to remember without being consumed. Yet the quiet was uneasy, and the unanswered questions hung heavy in the air. What lay beyond the silence? Was the hollow presence truly vanquished, or merely waiting, watching, biding its time in the shadows? Tom's fingers traced the edge of a photograph once more, his gaze lifting to the window where the first light of morning promised a tentative hope. The journey was far from over, but for now, in this fragile moment between night and day, grief and healing, he allowed himself to hope. And somewhere beyond the veil of silence, Claire's voice lingered, a whisper, a warning, a promise. The radios remained silent, but the story was not finished. The night had settled deep and heavy around the town, swallowing the narrow streets and shuttered windows in a thick, velvety darkness. Tom sat alone in his living room, the only light a pale, flickering glow emanating from the ancient radio perched on the rickety table before him. The room was quiet except for the faint crackle of static, the soft hiss of white noise that had become a constant companion since the radios had fallen silent days ago. But tonight, the static carried something else, subtle, almost imperceptible whispers weaving through the air like fragile threads of sound barely clinging to existence. Tom's breath caught. He leaned closer, eyes straining to pierce the dimness, fingers trembling as they hovered over the tuning dial. The voices were faint, fractured by static, but there, beneath the layered hiss, was a familiar cadence. It was Claire. Her voice, distant and ghostly, slipped through the air like a secret only he could hear. "Tom, be careful." The veil, still thin. His heart thudded painfully against his ribs, a mixture of hope and dread knotting inside his chest. For months, ever since the radio broadcasts had first begun, Tom had clung to the voices, the spectral warnings that had pulled him from numb grief into a desperate, obsessive quest. Now, as the night deepened, the whispers seemed to hum with a fragile persistence, as if the boundary between worlds trembled but had not yet sealed. The next day, Tom met Margaret at the town library, a sanctuary of faded books and dusty memories. The room smelled of old paper and quiet determination. Together, they sifted through brittle records and yellowed newspapers, searching for any clue that might explain the lingering echoes. As Tom placed his portable radio on the wooden table, a soft, trembling static filled the space, threading itself through the hushed rustle of pages turning. Margaret glanced up, her sharp eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "It's like the town itself is holding its breath," she said softly. "The grief, the loss, it's woven into everything here. Maybe that's what keeps the veil from closing completely." Tom nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. The diary they had uncovered weeks ago had revealed a cycle of sorrow and disappearance, a pattern that fed the hollow presence. Now, even in silence, the presence lingered, a shadow in the static, a whisper in the dark. Later, at Eli's cluttered radio station, the atmosphere was thick with the hum of machines and blinking lights. Eli, once a skeptic, now sat hunched over his equipment, adjusting dials with a focused intensity. His face, illuminated by the soft glow of meters and monitors, betrayed a mixture of unease and dawning belief. Suddenly, through the static, a faint voice threaded through, delicate, broken, unmistakably Claire's. Eli's breath caught, his fingers freezing on the controls. "Did you hear that?" he asked, voice low. "It's her, or something like her." The moment hung heavy, a fragile bridge between disbelief and something far darker. Eli's transformation from doubt to uneasy acceptance mirrored Tom's own journey, a reluctant acknowledgement that the hollow presence was not gone, merely waiting. As dawn crept over the horizon, Tom stood by his window, the town shrouded in mist and silence. The radio sat dormant beside him, but in the stillness, faint voices drifted on the morning breeze, ethereal and trembling. He closed his eyes, listening to the fragile whispers, the echoes of Claire's voice threading through the quiet. The boundary between worlds was still fragile, still porous, and though the immediate threat had receded, the haunting persisted, a lingering echo of grief, a whispered warning that the darkness waiting beyond was never far away. Tom's resolve hardened. He would keep listening, keep watching. For Claire, for the town, and for the fragile hope that even in loss, some connection remained, a thread of light through the static, a whisper against the silence. The voices were fading, but they were not gone. The hollow presence still stirred, and Tom knew the battle was far from over. He reached out, fingers brushing the radio's cold surface, and whispered into the quiet, "I'm still here." Outside, the mist shifted, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible reply. The night was not silent. Not yet. The dim light of the library's basement flickered uncertainly, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to dance with the whispers of the past. Dust motes floated lazily in the stale air, disturbed only by the soft rustling of old pages being turned. Margaret Lane's hands trembled slightly as she finally pulled open the ancient ledger she had discovered, hidden behind a false panel in the back wall. The book's leather cover was cracked and faded, the spine worn thin from decades, perhaps centuries of neglect. Tom stood close behind her, his breath shallow, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and desperate hope. The scent of old paper and mildew filled his nostrils, a sensory reminder of how deeply buried the town's darkest secrets had become. He leaned in, squinting to catch the faded ink and looping script, trying to decipher the archaic handwriting that chronicled events long forgotten. This isn't just a record of events," Margaret murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a ledger of sacrifices, rituals, and warnings. The town's founders, some of them, anyway, were aware of the darkness lurking beneath the surface. They tried to contain it, to keep it from spilling into our world. But their attempts failed." Tom swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a physical force. Failed how? Margaret traced a finger along the page, stopping at a passage that described a clandestine society known only as the Keepers. They had attempted to harness the collective grief of the townspeople, believing that by channeling sorrow and loss into ritual, they could seal away the malevolent force that now haunted their radios. But instead of banishing the darkness, their efforts had only fed it, strengthening the hollow presence that had slipped through the cracks between life and death. "It's a cycle," she said, her eyes meeting Tom's. "Every death, every moment of grief, every unanswered plight gives the hollow presence more power. And the more powerful it becomes, the harder it is to resist." Tom felt a cold shiver ripple down his spine, the pieces of the puzzle clicking together with a terrifying clarity. The entity wasn't just some random supernatural force. It was a living, growing manifestation of the town's pain and sorrow, an ancient predator awakened and nourished by human anguish. As Margaret continued to read, the storm outside began to grow. Thunder rolling softly in the distance, and a chill creeping through the basement's cracked walls. The flickering light above them struggled against the gathering darkness, as if the very air was charged with an ominous energy. "We've been fighting a losing battle," Tom whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But now that we know the truth, maybe we can find a way to break the cycle." Margaret nodded slowly, closing the ledger with a decisive snap. "It won't be easy. The history is full of failed attempts, and each time the hollow presence grows stronger. But understanding its nature is the first step." Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with bruised shades of orange and purple, Tom and Margaret found themselves standing in the fading light of the old town square. The bare branches of the trees stretched out like skeletal hands against the darkening sky, and the silence between them was heavy with the weight of their discovery. "The hollow presence feeds on grief," Margaret said softly, her breath visible in the cooling air. "That means if we can find a way to heal, to let go, we might starve it. But how? Tom asked, his voice cracking. "How do you make a town forget its pain?" "You don't," she replied. "You face it. You confront the sorrow, the fear, the loss together. Otherwise, it will keep coming back." Tom's gaze drifted to the quiet streets, the homes dark and still, as if holding their breath. The radios were silent now, but the absence of sound was no comfort. He knew the peace was fragile, a temporary lull in a storm that was far from over. Back in Margaret's study, the room was cluttered with notes, newspaper clippings, and the ledger now resting unopened on the desk. The faint hum of the town settled outside the window, the quiet punctuated only by the distant call of a night bird. Tom stared out at the streetlights, their halos blurred by a thin mist rising from the ground. The radio sat silent on the desk, its dials frozen, its speaker mute. Yet Tom felt the restless echo of voices in the stillness, the faintest trace of Claire's voice lingering at the edge of hearing. The knowledge they had uncovered both comforted and terrified him. The battle was no longer just about saving himself or his town, it was about breaking a cycle that had bound generations in sorrow and darkness. As the night deepened, Tom's thoughts spiraled through memories and possibilities, fears and hopes. The weight of the town's secrets settled on his shoulders, heavy but not unbearable. He was no longer alone in this fight. Margaret's calm presence, her fierce determination, gave him a sliver of light in the encroaching shadows. But the question remained, how to confront a force that thrived on grief itself. How to sever the tether that bound the living to the dead, to the hollow presence and its insatiable hunger. Tom's fingers brushed the edge of the radio, cold and still. Somewhere beyond the veil, he imagined Claire's voice calling to him, urging him onward. The road ahead was uncertain and perilous, but he had to walk it, for her, for the town, for himself. And as the first drops of rain began to patter against the window pane, the silence held its breath, waiting for the next move in a game that had been played for far too long. The secret was out. Now, the real fight could begin. The shadows had begun to seep into my waking hours, no longer content to lurk at the edges of night. They whispered, stretched, and twisted in ways that made the familiar world feel perilously strange. I would sit in the quiet of my living room, the old radio crackling with its usual static, and feel the air thick and thick with some unseen presence that bent light and sound around it. It was as if the very fabric of reality had loosened, and in the gaps, the hollow presence prowled. I could no longer tell when I was truly alone. The lines between memory and hallucination blurred. Sometimes I saw Claire's face in the flickering shadows cast by street lamps, her soft smile both a balm and a torment. Other times, her voice came through the radio, fractured and distant, calling my name with a tenderness that shattered my resolve. Each morning, I woke to a world that felt less real, the colors muted, sounds muffled as if filtered through a veil. The townsfolk seemed to notice the change too. Margaret, ever the steady anchor, met me in the library one overcast afternoon. Her sharp eyes softened with concern as I recounted the growing disturbances in my perception. The historical records we pored over took on new weight each tragedy, each disappearance, a thread in the tapestry of sorrow that fed the entity lurking in our midst. "Tom," Margaret said quietly, "you're carrying more than just grief. This entity, whatever it is, it feeds on the cracks in our reality. We have to find a way to seal those cracks before it consumes more of us." Eli, once a skeptic, had become an uneasy believer. His technical expertise was invaluable, but even he admitted the limits of science in explaining the phenomena. The radios sometimes emitted bursts of static that defied explanation, voices layering over each other in a cacophony of despair and warning. One evening, walking home beneath a bruised sky, the streetlights flickered and the shadows lengthened unnaturally. The silence between sounds stretched taut until I thought it might snap. A faint chorus of voices drifted on the wind, indistinct but unmistakably human. I quickened my pace, the sense of being watched prickling my skin. Back inside, the radio crackled to life without warning. Claire's voice emerged from the static, a fragile thread of sound that wove through the chaos. "Tom," she whispered, "the veil thins. Beware the shadows that hunger." A cold breath from the darkness brushed my neck. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw only the familiar outlines of my home distorted by the moonlight. Yet the feeling lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on my chest. Sleep became a battleground. Dreams and waking moments collided in a disorienting dance. Faces from the past appeared in the periphery of vision. Voices echoed from empty rooms, and the radio's static was a constant companion. I found myself talking aloud to the empty air, desperate for a response that never came. Despite the torment, a stubborn flame of determination burned within me. The town needed protection, and I was the only one who had glimpsed the true extent of the threat. But the cost was high. My mind frayed at the edges, each day a struggle to hold on to sanity. Margaret and Eli became my lifeline, anchors to the world I feared slipping away. We continued our research, seeking patterns, signs, anything that would give us an edge against the encroaching darkness. The diary entries revealed cycles of grief and loss that fed the entity, a parasitic force thriving on sorrow. "It's not just about stopping it," Eli said one night, eyes weary from hours of monitoring the radios. "We have to understand it." Understanding felt like chasing shadows, but it was all we had. As days passed, the line between protector and victim blurred. The hollow presence was no longer a distant threat. It was entwined with every breath I took, every shadow that flickered at the edge of vision. And yet, in the depths of the static, Claire's voice remained an anchor in the storm. Her warnings grew more urgent, a reminder that the battle was far from over. I steeled myself for the unknown, aware that the shadows were watching, waiting for me to falter. The unseen shadows had become a part of me, and the question was no longer if I would break, but when. Until then, I would fight. For Claire, for the town, for the fragile line between life and death that I was sworn to guard. But as I lay awake, the radio silent for a rare moment, I wondered if the line was already gone, and if the darkness had claimed me long ago. The night stretched on, thick with possibility and peril. Somewhere beyond the veil, the hollow presence waited. And so did I. The shadows were no longer just around me, they were inside me. The night was unusually still, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes every small sound feel amplified. Tom sat motionless in his dimly lit living room, the weight of months of grief and fear settling like a stone in his chest. His fingers rested lightly on the worn radio's dial, a device that had become both his tether and his torment since Claire's death. Tonight, the static had been louder than usual, a relentless hiss that seemed to claw at the edges of his sanity. Then, through the crackling interference, a voice emerged, faint, yet unmistakably hers. "Tom, listen carefully." Claire's voice whispered, fragile but urgent. "The boundary, it's breaking again. You must be ready, it's not over." The room seemed to shrink around him, shadows stretching and contracting as if breathing with the warning. Tom's breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Every fiber of his being screamed to reach out, to respond, but all he could do was listen. The voice faded, swallowed by static once more, leaving behind a silence heavier than before. He leaned back, eyes closed, the echo of her words reverberating in his mind. This was no longer just a message from beyond. It was a summons, a final plea that he could not ignore. The fragile barrier between worlds, so easily disturbed by grief and fear, was weakening once again. And this time, the consequences would be dire. Morning found Tom at the local library, seated across from Margaret and Eli in the cramped back room where town records and radio equipment cluttered every surface. Margaret's sharp eyes scanned the brittle, yellowed diary, her fingers tracing faded entries that spoke of past tragedies eerily similar to their own. Eli, headphones around his neck, adjusted dials and checked frequencies, his skepticism replaced by a cautious belief. "It's happening again," Margaret said quietly, her voice tinged with worry. "The cycle repeats. The hollow presence feeds on grief, and the town's sorrow only makes it stronger." Eli nodded, tapping a few keys on his laptop. "If Claire's warning is true, we need to understand how to contain it, or at least prepare for what's coming." Tom listened, absorbing their words like a man bracing for a storm. The knowledge was a double-edged sword, comforting in its clarity, terrifying in its implications. He realized that his role was no longer just about seeking answers or clinging to memories. He was now a guardian, a barrier between the living and the encroaching darkness. That evening, Tom wandered the mist-laden streets of the town, the cold air biting at his skin, his breath forming small clouds in the fading light. The familiar silence of the sleeping town was broken only by a distant crackling, errant radio signal, flickering through the fog like a ghostly heartbeat. Each step Tom took felt weighted, as though the ground beneath him trembled with unseen forces. He stopped beneath a flickering street lamp and closed his eyes, recalling Claire's voice, the urgency in her tone. The pain of loss was still raw, but beneath it now lay a steely resolve. He was no longer just a broken man haunted by memories. He was a sentinel standing watch at the fragile boundary between two worlds. Returning home, Tom sat once more by the radio. The device, silent for hours, suddenly burst to life with a burst of static before Claire's voice returned, clearer than before. "Remember, Tom," she said softly, "the line is thin. Protect those you love. Do not let the darkness cross." And then, silence. The radio fell into an oppressive quiet, leaving Tom alone with the weight of the moment. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper. Yet within him burned a cautious hope, a determination forged from grief and love. The fight was far from over. As he stared into the darkness, Tom knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one where he must confront not only the hollow presence, but also the depths of his own fear and sorrow. The final warning had been given, and he was ready to face whatever came next. The radios may be silent now, but the echoes of the past and the promise of the future hummed quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the moment they would rise again. The boundary was fragile, but Tom Harper was no longer a man broken by loss. He was a guardian standing watch alone, haunted but unyielding, and the night held its breath. The old radio sat in the corner of the living room, its wooden casing dulled by years of neglect, the dial glowing faintly in the shadows. Tom Harper had not paid it much mind since Claire's passing 6 months ago. It had become little more than a relic, a background fixture in the hollow silence that filled the house. But that night, the static that usually accompanied his restless nights took on a different quality. He was drawn to it, his fingers twitching with an urgency he could neither understand nor resist. The air hummed with an uneasy energy as he turned the dial slowly, the needle jittering erratically across the frequency band. At first, There was nothing but the familiar hiss and crackle of white noise, a sound that had become strangely comforting in its constancy. But then, beneath the static, a voice emerged, a voice so faint it might have been imagined, yet unmistakable in its timbre. "Tom," it whispered, fragile as a breath, yet piercing the stillness like a shard of glass. His heart seized, breath caught in his throat. The voice was hers, Claire, closer than memory, yet fractured as if carried through a veil of static and distance. "They're coming. You must be ready." He froze, every rational thought fleeing in the wake of that tender, haunting sound. His hands trembled as he reached to adjust the dial, desperate to clear the interference, to hear her more clearly. But the voice slipped away, swallowed once more by the crackling abyss. Questions flooded his mind. Was it grief, a cruel trick conjured by his longing? Or something else, something beyond the veil that separated life from death? The room seemed to grow colder, shadows crawling along the walls, as if alive, listening. Tom sat back, eyes fixed on the radio's glowing dial, heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. The town outside was quiet, but he felt this shift in the air, the subtle undercurrent of something waiting, watching. The static had become a language, and Claire's voice was its first word. That night marked a turning point. The fragile whisper from beyond the grave ignited a desperate hope within him, pulling him from the depths of his sorrow and into a world where the boundaries between the living and the dead blurred, and the radio's whispered secrets no one was meant to hear. He was no longer alone, but the warning lingered. They were coming, and he had no idea what it meant. As he sat in the dark, the static whispered on, carrying voices both familiar and unknown, weaving a tapestry of grief, dread, and the faintest glimmer of hope. His journey had begun.